Mm. So let's sort of go through the posture from, you know, floor to ceiling or something like that. So here's a thing to try out. The the s- the standard mudra for zazen is this sort of cosmic mudra thing, but when you're sitting seiza, that doesn't work as well because it keeps your hands too low. Have you ever done this one where you put your uh, right thumb inside your left palm, you wrap your left thumb around it, and then you fold your hands together and hold it like this? Yeah, it sits a little higher, and it kind of sits right against your hara, which is nice. So that's worth, at least experimenting with. Um, yeah, I mean, the great thing about seiza, particularly on a bench, is that it it has a lot of the features of full lotus, right? So if you're sitting in full lotus, your knees are fairly close together, and the downward pressure on on your knees is pretty even, and the tripod of support for your upper body, between your knees and your butt sitting on the bench is um, has approximately the right distribution of weight. Like you probably have um, more weight on your sit bones than you do on your knees, but they still feel like they're all a contributor to holding you up, right? And you can, if you press down with your right knee and then with your left knee, you can use that to find a balance point in the middle where when it's like if you press down with your right knee, you go a little bit and all of a sudden gravity grabs you, right? So you press down with your left knee, you go a little bit and gravity grabs you. Somewhere right in the middle of there, between those 2 points, is upright. And similarly with front and back, right? So if you rock forward and back just by allowing your weight to be caught more by your knees, and then allowing it to be caught more by your stomach muscles, basically, there you can find the middle point where you're upright. Mm. And then from there, the tilt of your pelvis probably um, bears some experimentation, right? So if you tilt your pelvis forward, after a while you start to feel some compression in your lower spine, and maybe some strain across um, your psoas muscles. If you tilt it the other way, after a while your back starts to bow, and you feel the strain a little bit further down your thighs because your muscles are like, oh wait, come back, right? So to find the sweet spot there as well, right? Mm. And then once your lower body posture is kind of established and solid, to well, I guess what if we do this? So right down, underneath your navel and sort of right in the middle of your body, there's this place in Japanese, they call it the hara. It's kind of, it's like one of the sort of yogic locks, this your sort of abdominal lock in yoga, right? Um, and to put your attention there, it's the bottom of your diaphragm, so it's involved in breathing. To put your attention there, and to start with, imagine that there's a pillar planted in your hara that's supporting your sternum. So that can produces this kind of little lift in your chest. Your shoulders settle, and the the sort of muscles and skin in your upper and upper middle back kind of relax a little bit when that happens. And then furthermore, with your hara, you can try this for breathing. So at least a few times try on the out breath, bringing a little bit of tension to your hara, which is to say a little bit of tension to your lower abdominal muscles and maybe the muscles in your pelvic floor. And with that focus and a really gentle tension there, breathe all the way out. And then when you're breathed all the way out, just pause and wait for your diaphragm to say, okay, time to breathe in. And you'll notice when you do this that on the out breath, often the out breath carries with it some of the tension and misalignment in your upper body and just drops it into your heart. It's as though it straightens your posture and balances your upper body. So maybe do that breath 3 to 5 times, and then let go your concentration a little bit, but keep your attention in your hara so you can sort of watch your breath from there. Let your head float up off your shoulders. Allow your face to fall into a vertical plane with your chin resting lightly on this big sort of platform of muscle that runs around your lower jaw. Your eyes open and downcast, and your gaze soft and wide. And let's sit for a bit. Is the bird song inside or outside your body? How would you know? The ancient instructions for Zazen say something like, think not thinking, how to think not thinking, non-thinking. And they don't explain it all. Though earlier on they say, cease all movements of the conscious mind, the gauging of thoughts and views. So there's a little bit of a hint. The request is to not weigh or measure the experience. When a bird song arrives, it's a bird song. Give it its due. When a thought comes up, it's a thought. Give it its due. And in either case, allow it to come and go in a way that is curious and self-empathic, but lets go as easily as it lets things come in. And that's what they mean by non-thinking. So just to notice how perceptions arise and pass away usually without too much fanfare. Now, some thoughts are like that, and then some thoughts have enough juice to entangle the attention for some period of time and then let go. That's all. Just to notice the way the attention falls on a perception as it arises. Maybe does a little work with it and then lets it go. Notice the way, even after a thought event that is absorbing enough to draw your attention away, when you land back in awareness, nothing is hidden by that. It's all right there in your body and in your mind. And just to attend to it thoroughly and wholeheartedly. That's non-thinking. If you discover that you're tangled up in thought or maybe agitated or distracted in the middle of sitting, it can help to return to that concerted breath with a slight emphasis on the out breath and the pause at the bottom of the breath. Just for a bit. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. 3 to 5 breaths, and then watch what happens after that. Allow the breath to help straighten any slippage in your posture or maybe address any discomfort that might have arisen. So it seems like maybe we should turn on some lights, because otherwise we're going to become invisible. And I don't mind becoming invisible, but we are live streaming or something, right? So that's a good idea. So I thought we could stretch a bit before we do anything else. Let's see. No, not so far. Wonderful. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And we're probably visible now. So yeah, I guess you can shake your legs out a little bit. And arrange them in a way that feels comfortable. And then maybe, so place your right hand on top of your head with a little bit of overlap over to the left side of your head, and then gently, without pulling too hard, bring your head over towards, but not, certainly you don't want to be squishing it, towards your right shoulder. Let your left shoulder relax. You can feel a stretch all the way down into your left arm. And then place your hand under your right temple and push your head back up. You don't need to pick it up, just push it up. And then similarly on the other side, place your left hand on your head. Gently pull your head down and towards the left, and relax your right shoulder. And then lift your head back up straight. Place your right hand on your left knee, wrap your left arm around behind your back, and twist, sitting upright to the left. Look over your left shoulder. Try and keep your back straight so that the twist runs all the way down your spine, all the way into your hips. Then come back to the center. Maybe relax there for a moment, and then place your left palm on your right knee. Twist around to the right. Wrap your right arm around behind your back and look over your right shoulder. Keeping your back straight. Great. And then, let's see, what time is it? Cool. Okay, so clasp your hands together behind your back. Start to raise your arms so that your shoulders are pulled back and your chest opens up, and then bend No, you don't have to bend particularly far, but bend with your back straight and raise your arms to a comfortable height. If you get far enough forward, you can feel, well, at least if you're sitting in half lotus, you can feel the stretch in your thighs. Keep your back flat and then upright. Mm. Okay. So that was a lot of stuff. Any questions about any of it? About the posture? Any discomforts or difficulties? Any stuff about the mental framing of it? Zen in general? Questions? Well, good.
I have a question actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I like the instruction you gave about investigating if the bird sound is inside the body or outside the body. And
Mhm.
within Zen in general, is it inherently non-dual, or is that kind of an outside thing, or is that more common?
It's a great question. I mean, the interesting thing about about the Zen school is that it's fundamentally a practice that requests over and over again dropping dualistic thinking, imagining, formulation, and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? And at the same time, the 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 teachings are the Zen teachings are full of dualistic formulations, right? So, like for example, like there's this um, one of the kind of foundations of philosophical or maybe philosophy of mind foundations of Zen is that there are these kind of roughly two major modes of engagement with the world. There's this sort of conventional cognition, which is fundamentally dualistic and generates categories and makes plans and all the rest of that sort of thing. It's based on language, right? And then there's this broader sphere or mode of engagement that isn't so concerned with any of that, actually, right? And that just meets the world in a way that it's not that there's no um, you know it's not like you're seeing ultimate reality or anything, but it's way less conditioned and categorized and so on than the other mode, right? And so in there are various ways of naming that in the history of the Zen school, and among them are, you know, big mind and small mind, right? Which would you rather, et cetera. It's a so it's a complicated situation, but in the end, the fundamental teaching is um, it's it's neither one nor two. You know, uh, cognition and phenomena are not one and not two, and mind and body are not one and not two. And um, and the request is to explore exactly what that means for sort of the rest of your life, basically. Does that help? Or
Yeah, it's funny. I'll think about not quite one, not quite two. Where does that come from?
it's a pretty old. I mean, so Suzuki Roshi uses it, right? But it's a pretty old um, teaching from kind of it pops up in the teachings of the sort of early pre-Zen Buddhist schools in China, basically, like maybe even in Jury's sort of the philosophical foundations of the Tendai school, but certainly some of the later ones. So that's where I've seen it first, and it's kind of not unrelated to some ideas in Taoism too, right? So anyway, something like that.
I have a question.
Of course.
So and I don't have particular Zen experience, but
Mhm.
I just go through a practice of letting go. Thought comes up,
Mhm.
sensation, let go. And sometimes I wonder if I'm too, too fixated on the letting go, or if I'm gripping too hard, or I'm too continuous with the letting go.
Mm.
So I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there is this, I think, largely correct observation in not just in the Zen school, I think in a lot of meditative schools that until you're sort of self-narrating, self-constructing, categorizing, planning, and scheming mind settles down at least once, just enough that you can kind of see around it, right? That it's hard to know what all this practice is for, right? In some ways, right? Um, on the other hand, humans are thinking beings. That's what we do. I mean, I'm just reading this book by Lisa Feldman Barrett, um, who in the first paragraph says, "Your brain was not developed for thinking." It was developed for something completely different, essentially. But by by certainly by now, and as by the time Descartes rolled around, we, we pretty much identify the self with thinking, right? And that's kind of, it's both great and a big issue, right? Um, and so I would say, in the end, it's you can't condemn yourself for thinking, right? And I'm not saying that you're doing that, right? But I mean, the most extreme version of that would be condemning yourself for thinking, right? Um, my experience with it is this: everybody has a cycle of attention, right? And the length of the cycle is in the sort of seconds to tens of seconds range, right? And that when you're on the sort of aware end of that cycle, right, where your connection to your perception and the mental formations that arise just out of hearing birdsong or something like that is pretty direct, and in that mode it's really, really obvious and easy to see how um, perceptions arise lead to a little bit of mental activity and then fall away, and the next perception becomes the center of your attention briefly, right, etc. And there's generally no friction whatsoever, right? What eventually happens while you're doing that is that things will suggest themselves as stuff to think about, and eventually one will come up that has enough juice to grab your attention, right? And that transition from attending to the the phenomena, let's put it that way, right? And from attending to phenomena to attending to cognition, my experience is that transition is impossible to observe, right? And other people say that too. It's not just me. And I think the reason is that something about that transition causes this kind of erasure of our attention to the present moment in a way, and so all of a sudden you're caught in thinking, and your attention contracts away from the broader experience, and you're thinking of thought, right? And feeling the emotions that go along with that thought, and so on and so forth, right? But if you spend a bunch of time observing your personal cycle of attention, my experience and the experience of other people is that even in the middle of thinking, your mind and body present you with opportunities to pay attention to the world, right? To phenomena, and it's pretty obvious why that would be useful, right? It's like, should we check in on what's going on out there? Oh yeah, let's do that. Okay, should we checking? It happens pretty regularly, right? And one of the functions of the training that happens in Zazen is that you become increasingly aware of those invitations to attend to the broader picture of what it is to be you living, right? And it becomes easier and easier to just step into that, right? Um, and so in other words, for your attention to move seamlessly back and forth between thinking and essentially non-thinking, right? Um, and I think in the end, allowing that to develop is probably a good idea. So Dogen says, you probably haven't read this, right? Yeah. So I mentioned the ancient instructions for Zazen. He wrote the ancient instructions for Zazen in the 13th century. Other people wrote instructions earlier, but he wrote this sort of definitive set of instructions. And not in that document, but in a related document, he said something like, study the way is to study the self. Have you heard this? And to study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be awakened by everything, right? And when you're awakened by everything, that no trace of it remains, and that no trace lasts forever, basically. But what he means when he says study the self is exactly to study the functioning of your attention and your cycle of attention, right? And over time, what happens is that study leads to an increasingly steady connection with this mode of engagement that doesn't really care much about the self. It's not so much that you forget it, it's just that it's no longer the center of attention, right? And it comes up and sort of sticks around, right? And that just happens naturally when we sit and don't spend too much time messing with it. So does that make sense, or what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, would you say at some level when you experience it, you know it? Is that
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely know it. I mean, it often appears as a kind of insight. This experience sort of, arises and reaches into your conscious cognizing mind and goes, oh well, look at that, right? For me, there's this claim in the Zen literature that mind itself is Buddha, right? And you read it a bunch of times and you think, mind itself is Buddha, mind itself is Buddha. And then you have this experience and you're like, oh, I see, that's what they mean by that, right? Anyway, so yeah, it happens naturally, and it's just and it well, there's a poem about this. It was written by the founder of the Soto Zen School in China during the Tang Dynasty, and he says, I'm not going to go through the whole poem, but he basically says, when you first see it, you have no idea what you're looking at. And then the next stanza of the poem talks about how it just kind of sneaks up on you, right? And then it kind of develops. It's a essentially 5 stanza poem, and the last stanza is, when you're not worried about has or has not, then really, nobody can get a handle on you, basically. Says everybody wants to be extraordinary, but in the end, you just come home and you sit by the fire. That's what he says, right? It's the point being that your relationship between the mind of unloaded, receptive, non-dualistic attention and the mind of, categorizing, planning, self-constructing, and self-narrating, the relationship between those things settles into a kind of a comfortable dynamic, basically. And we live our entire life in practice in the tangle between those two modes of engagement, right? So something like that.
So is the introductory instruction essentially observe the mind and let go?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's so, that's an excellent segue into the talk I was thinking about giving. But I mean, basically, there was this idea that developed during the course of Buddhist history, and nobody really is sure when it developed, but that, like there was the life of Buddha and the Buddhist teachings, right? And everybody that actually encountered the Buddha kind of woke up, right? And then the Buddha died, right? And the teachings were assembled, and people started going around and expounding them, and sometimes that was powerful enough to sort of enlighten people, right? And then things got worse and worse and worse, and the idea was that by the time, if, by a few hundred years later, it was the age of the decline of the Dharma, right? And And somewhere in the middle there, people started writing new material, but it was always written as though it were the words of the Buddha. So there was a lot of manufacturing of scripture that was credited to the Buddha, and there were a number of justifications for why it hadn't, why it was newly discovered or something like that. And so things went on like that. And then interestingly, when Buddhism landed in China, there was this real transformation, which kind of started with some of the early schools, but it in the end, it developed kind of into the Zen school, right? And it, the original arrival of Buddhism in China involved a lot of, carrying books from India and Southeast Asia and so on and so forth, and, dumping them in a big library somewhere, and then sitting down and translating them, and then giving them to monks who would recite them and, comment on them and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? And catalog them. And that went on for a while. And then as the Zen school developed, the sort of axioms of the Zen school, as they were finally formulated, and nobody really knows how that development happened. It's very complicated, but were one, actual transmission of the Dharma happens in relationships, right? It's not it's not inherently embedded in scripture or in words, right? And the practice involved is pointing directly at the mind, right? Those are the two axioms of Zen, basically. So, and if you want, and the added later were these collections of the exploits and teachings of the Chinese masters that were intended to demonstrate what it means to transmit the Dharma in the context of relationships, right? So the practice is pointing at the mind and allowing the mind to work in the way that it actually does, staying close to that, and noticing what happens both in the middle and on the periphery. And initially, this sort of other mode of being, the other mode of engagement that we're talking about, shows up on the periphery, like the second stanza of the Five Ranks, the one that addresses this. It says, she gets up late, she's walking down the hall, turns the corner, and there's a mirror, right? So it just kind of sneaks up on you, right? While you're in the middle of your life and practice, basically. And the rest of the stanza is, she recognizes herself, but mistakes her reflection for her head, right? And after a while, that gets clarified, right? So pointing directly at the mind, attending to the actual activity of being a live human being, and watching how that study transforms the relationship between the various parts of your mind, basically. What kind of meditative practice have you been doing mostly?
An irregular one.
Yeah, nice.
I would do non-dual, but it's been a little while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I have a striving tendency. And
Yeah.
so I think sometimes I strive a bit in whatever the form is.
Yeah. Me too. And it's a funny thing. Again, the teachings are full of potentially misleading statements. Like there's one of the primary books in the koan literature is this book called The Gateless Gate, right? And the first koan is this famous koan about a dog. The monk asked Jiao, "Hey, does a dog have Buddha nature or not?" And Jiao in this version of the koan just says, "Wu," which means no, and is translated into Japanese as mu. So it's the mu koan, right? And in the commentary, he goes, if you can break through the barrier presented by this koan, right? You'll be able to walk along with the ancient masters and look them in the eyes and all the rest of that sort of thing. Won't that be great? And so he's clearly setting up this sort of aspirational striving, right? And then he just says, like, go to it, right? And the in some ways that's the function of this practice, right? Is that you sit down with your essentially spiritual ambition. They have the polite word for it is bodhicitta, right? You sit down with your spiritual ambition and are again and again brought up against the functioning of your spiritual ambition in the context of practice, right? And eventually, maybe not the first time or the 10th time or the 1,000th time, but eventually you let go, right? And then something else happens, basically. And as a striver, I totally get it, right? But that's how it works. And you can there's the gate generally that helps with that you can open, that helps with letting go, is turning your attention not so much to not thinking, but turning your attention to your embodied experience, right? Your in particular, this book that I'm reading makes the outrageous but probably completely true claim that the entire foundation of our mental activity is just this big feedback loop between our body's allostatic function and our proprioceptive sensing of the body, right? It's like there's just this massive process going on all the time, sensing the body, adjusting it, making sure it's not using too much energy anywhere, and so on and so forth, right? And so just to open to that and watch how that doesn't abolish thinking, but it kind of softens the underlying emotional drivers of our thinking in a way and makes it more tractable and fluid, I think. Yeah. Does that make sense in terms of your experience? Or yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
when I first started, I was very breath focused, but then that was too, when is it now, years ago?
Yeah.
That was almost too narrowing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gripping.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Cool. Well, The koan I was going to incorporate into my talk, I barely have time for it, but it was like this. There's this teacher named Jingqing, and a student asks him, he says, "I'm breaking out. I asked the teacher to break in." And it's a bird metaphor. So speaking of birds, right? The idea is like there's a bird and an egg, right? So you're the bird and the egg, and you're like tapping to get out, and the mother bird is supposed to peck to help, right? And and Jingxing says, well, if I help you break out, will you live? And and the monk says, well, if I couldn't live, then I'd be a laughing stock. And Jingxing says, you're just another man in the weeds, basically. So, I mean, that's got that mainly is about the nature of teaching, right? But it's also about it's about the process that we're talking about here as well, right? Like you can induce in yourself this impulse to let go, right? Yeah, absolutely. And this impulse to quiet the mind. Yeah, absolutely. In the long run, though, the if you're going to if your practice is going to have a sort of lasting beneficial effect, all of that stuff kind of has to take its own course, right? And happen in its own complicated way. And tragically, it's different for everybody, right? Because everybody is conditioned and built differently, right? And so, the when people say, well, all the Dharma transmission in the world happens in the context of relationship, right? The fundamental question is, what exactly is getting transmitted, right? In fact, mainly it's, this whole thing of pecking and tapping, it's mainly just a case of mutual recognition, right? You and I both recognize something fundamental and straightforward about the activity of practice and the mind, right? And we can talk about it, but mainly you have to realize it and express it in your own way, sort of. So anyway. And on that note, thank you. It was great. Thanks for coming in.